Hello, and welcome to History in Twilight. Tonight, we're going to shatter everything you think you know about one of history's most misunderstood civilizations. Picture this. The year is 1519. Spanish conquistadors crest a mountain pass in central Mexico, and below them, shimmering like a jewel in the morning sun, lies a city unlike anything they have ever seen. It's larger than Paris, cleaner than London, more magnificent than Rome itself. One soldier will later write that they thought they were dreaming, that such a place could not possibly be real. This is Tenochtitlan, heart of the Aztec Empire. But here's what they don't tell you in school. This wasn't a civilization of savages waiting to be rescued by European enlightenment. This was a sophisticated society of engineers, astronomers, poets, and physicians. They built floating gardens that outproduced modern agriculture. They performed successful brain surgery. They educated every single child, boys and girls alike, something Europe wouldn't achieve for centuries. Yes, they practiced human sacrifice. We'll talk about that, honestly and in context. But if that's all you know about the Aztecs, then you've been sold a lie. A convenient lie that justified genocide and erased one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple way to support what we do here, and it means the world to me. I'm also always curious, where in the world are you right now, and what time is it as you're listening? Drop a comment below. I love hearing from you. Now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Dim the lights if you can. Tonight, we're traveling back to a world of jade and obsidian, of pyramids rising from lake waters, and the scent of sacred copal incense drifting through stone corridors. This is the story of the Aztec Empire, the real story, the one that history almost forgot. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Impossible City. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing beside Hernan Cortés on that November morning in 1519. You've been marching for months through jungle and desert, fighting battles, making uneasy alliances with local tribes who hate the Aztecs. You've heard wild stories, tales that seemed like pure fantasy. A great empire ruled from a city built in the middle of a lake, streets of water instead of dirt, temples covered in gold, markets larger than anything in Spain. You didn't believe a word of it. And then you reach the mountain pass between the volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, and you see it. The Valley of Mexico spreads before you, and there, in the center of a vast turquoise lake, lies Tenochtitlan. The city seems to float on the water like a mirage. Gleaming white causeways stretch across the lake like ribbons, connecting the island city to the shore. Pyramids rise from the heart of the city, their sides painted brilliant red and white and blue. Thousands of canoes dot the water like water bugs, moving between the city and the chinampas, the famous floating gardens that surround it. The soldier Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was actually there, would later write, "We were amazed, and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. They were not dreaming. Tenochtitlan was absolutely real, and it was staggering. The numbers alone tell an incredible story. In 1519, Tenochtitlan had a population of between 200,000 and 300,000 people. To put that in perspective, London at the same time had about 50,000 inhabitants. Paris had perhaps 225,000. Only 4 cities in all of Europe were larger, and most were smaller, far smaller. But size wasn't everything. What truly shocked the Spanish was how the city worked. Tenochtitlan was clean, spectacularly clean. The streets were swept daily. There was a sophisticated waste management system. Human waste was collected in canoes and taken to the chinampas to be used as fertilizer, a practice that was both hygienic and agriculturally brilliant. There were public toilets throughout the city. Fresh water flowed into the city through dual aqueducts, an engineering marvel that ensured the city always had clean drinking water, even when one aqueduct needed repairs. Compare this to European cities of the time, where people dumped their chamber pots out of windows into the streets below, where waste and filth accumulated in open gutters, where clean water was a luxury and disease was rampant. The Spanish, who came from this world, walked through Tenochtitlan in a state of shock. The great market at Tlatelolco, the sister city just north of Tenochtitlan proper, was unlike anything in the Western Hemisphere, and larger than most markets in Europe. Cortés estimated that 60,000 people came to this market every single day. You could buy anything there: jade from the south, turquoise from the north, jaguar pelts, brilliant tropical bird feathers, obsidian blades sharper than Spanish steel, cacao beans, which served as currency, live animals, prepared foods, cloth, pottery, gold, and silver. The market was so well organized that each type of merchandise had its own section. There were market judges who settled disputes on the spot. There were porters for hire. There were money changers. It was a sophisticated commercial system that rivaled anything in Seville or Venice. At the heart of the city stood the sacred precinct, the Templo Mayor, a massive twin pyramid dedicated to the war god Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc. This was the spiritual and political center of an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, from the deserts of the north to the jungles of the south. But here is the question that should astound you. How do you build such a city in the middle of a lake? The answer reveals the true genius of the Aztec people. When the Aztecs first arrived at Lake Texcoco in the early 1400s, they claimed a swampy, unwanted island that no one else wanted. It was not prime real estate. There was no farmland. There was no fresh water. There was barely any dry land at all. What they did have was determination and an extraordinary talent for engineering. They invented the Chinampa system, often called floating gardens, though they didn't actually float. These were artificial islands, built up from the lake bed, using layers of mud, decaying vegetation, and reeds, held in place by willow trees, whose roots anchored everything together. These chinampas were incredibly fertile, capable of producing 7 harvests per year. They turned a useless swamp into the most productive farmland in Mesoamerica. They built causeways, massive raised roads that connected their island to the mainland. These weren't simple bridges. They were architectural marvels, wide enough for 10 horses to ride abreast, with removable sections that could be taken up to defend the city from attack. They built the dual aqueduct system from springs at Chapultepec, bringing fresh water across the lake on stone channels raised above the water. They built a dike, stretching 9 miles across the lake, separating the salty eastern waters from the fresher western side, protecting their city and their chinampas from flooding. All of this, remember, was built without wheels, without beasts of burden, without iron tools. The city you see in 1519, the city that made hardened Spanish soldiers think they were dreaming, was not the work of primitive people. It was the creation of master engineers, urban planners, and hydraulic experts. Tenochtitlan was not a miracle. It was the result of human ingenuity, determination, and an unshakable vision. But this magnificent city, this impossible achievement, was not built in a day. Its story begins not with glory, but with struggle. It begins with a wandering people, despised and rejected, searching for a home. It begins with a prophecy. Chapter 2. From Outcasts to Empire. The story of how the Aztecs built an empire is not the story they teach in textbooks. It's stranger, more brutal, and far more interesting. Let's start with the name. Aztec is actually a term invented centuries later. They called themselves the Mexica, pronounced me, S-H-E-E-K, and they were absolutely not the original inhabitants of the Valley of Mexico. They were newcomers, outsiders, and for a very long time, everybody hated them. The Mexica, according to their own histories, came from a place called Aztlan, somewhere far to the north. Scholars still debate where Aztlan actually was, or if it even existed as a real place, rather than a mythic homeland. What we know for certain is that sometime in the early 1200s, the Mexica left wherever they came from and began a long, brutal migration south. They were not a mighty people. They were a poor, nomadic tribe, looked down upon by the more established civilized peoples of central Mexico. They hired themselves out as mercenaries. They were unwelcome guests, constantly driven from place to place. When they asked permission to settle, they were refused. When they tried to settle anyway, they were attacked. The other peoples of the valley viewed them as crude barbarians, uncultured and violent. There's a telling story that when the Mexica finally convinced one city-state to let them settle on some rocky, snake-infested land outside the city, they repaid this grudging hospitality by asking the king if they could marry his daughter. The king, foolishly, agreed. The Mexica invited him to a ceremony to honor his daughter. When he arrived, he discovered they had sacrificed her and flayed her skin. A priest was wearing her skin as part of a religious ritual honoring the goddess Xochiquetzal. The king, understandably horrified, drove them out at spear point. This is not a story of noble savages. This is a story of a desperate people doing desperate, often terrible things to survive. But they had one thing that kept them going: a prophecy. Their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war and the sun, had promised them that they would know their destined homeland when they saw a very specific sign: an eagle, perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. For decades, they searched. For decades, they wandered. And then, in the year 1325, on a marshy, unwanted island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, they saw it. Now, we have to be careful here. Is this story literally true? Probably not. The image of the eagle and the serpent appears on Mexican flags and currency today, and it's become so mythologized that it's hard to separate legend from history. What probably happened is that the Mexica, after decades of being pushed around, finally claimed the one piece of land nobody else wanted: a swampy, snake-filled island with no resources. It was, to be blunt, a terrible place to build a city, and that's precisely why they were allowed to stay there. But here's where the story gets interesting. The Mexica turned their weakness into strength. They understood something fundamental. They could not defeat their powerful neighbors through military might alone. They were too small, too weak, too poor. So instead, they used something more powerful than obsidian-tipped spears. They used politics. The Valley of Mexico in the 1400s was a complex world of competing city-states, each with its own ruler, its own alliances, its own ambitions. The dominant power was a city called Azcapotzalco, ruled by a tyrant named Tezozomoc. Smaller cities like Texcoco and Tlacopan lived in Azcapotzalco's shadow, forced to pay tribute, their independence slowly eroding. The Mexica, from their unwanted island, watched and waited. They married their daughters to nobles of other cities, creating blood ties. They served as mercenaries for Azcapotzalco, proving their military value while learning the politics of the region. They played the long game. When Tezozomoc died in 1426, his succession sparked a war. Different factions backed different heirs. The valley erupted into violence, and the Mexica saw their chance. They allied themselves with Texcoco and Tlacopan, two cities that were also chafing under Azcapotzalco's dominance. Together, they went to war against the tyrant city, and in 1428 they won. This victory changed everything. The three allied cities, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, formed what became known as the Triple Alliance. This was the political foundation of what we call the Aztec Empire, though they would never have used that term. Each city maintained its own ruler, its own identity, but they agreed to act together in war and to share the tribute from conquered peoples. In practice, Tenochtitlan quickly became the dominant partner. The Mexica, who just decades earlier had been despised wanderers, were now the leading power in the valley. But they didn't stop there. Under a series of brilliant and ruthless rulers, Tenochtitlan expanded outward. They conquered cities throughout central Mexico. They pushed into Oaxaca to the south. They seized control of the crucial trade routes leading to both coasts. Within less than a century, they had built the largest empire Mesoamerica had ever seen. How did they do it? Yes, they were fierce warriors. Aztec warriors were trained from childhood, and they were genuinely terrifying in battle with their cotton armor, their obsidian-edged war clubs called macuatl, their atlatls that could hurl darts with lethal force. But the real secret of their success was more subtle. The Aztec Empire was not primarily built on occupation. It was built on tribute. When the Aztecs conquered a city, they didn't usually replace the local rulers. They didn't force everyone to speak Nahuatl or worship Huitzilopochtli. Instead, they did something simpler and, in many ways, smarter. They demanded tribute. Every conquered city had to send regular shipments of goods to Tenochtitlan: jade, cacao, cotton cloth, precious feathers, gold, or whatever that region produced. They had to provide warriors when called upon, and they had to acknowledge Tenochtitlan's supremacy. But beyond that, they were largely left alone. This was an empire built more on economics than on cultural domination. It was a protection racket on a civilizational scale, but it was also remarkably efficient. There was one other crucial element to Aztec expansion: the famous Flower Wars, or Exoquiahuatl. These were ritualized conflicts fought between the Aztecs and certain rival states, particularly Tlaxcala to the east. These weren't wars of conquest. They were something stranger, battles fought by mutual agreement, with the primary goal of capturing prisoners for sacrifice. Now, this sounds bizarre to us, and many historians have struggled to explain it. Was it really just about getting sacrificial victims? That seems wasteful. The truth is probably more complex. The Flower Wars served multiple purposes. They kept warriors trained and battle-hardened during times of peace. They demonstrated military prowess. They served religious functions, and yes, they provided captives. But they also did something else. They maintained a permanent state of controlled conflict with certain rivals. Tlaxcala, for instance, was surrounded by Aztec territory but never conquered. Why? Because Tlaxcala served as a useful enemy, a place to send young warriors to prove themselves, a constant reminder of the need for military readiness. This would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. When the Spanish arrived, the Tlaxcalans, who had been fighting the Aztecs for generations, would become their most important allies. The Flower Wars had created not just enemies, but enemies who knew Aztec military tactics inside and out, and who burned with resentment. But in 1519, that disaster still lay in the future. For now, the Mexica stood at the height of their power. The despised wanderers had become the masters of an empire. The unwanted island had become the greatest city in the hemisphere. They had fulfilled the prophecy. They had found their home. They had built something magnificent. And they were about to lose it all. Chapter 3: The Empire Machine. The Aztec Empire was not held together by fear alone. It was held together by one of the most sophisticated economic systems in the pre-modern world: the tribute network. Imagine you're a scribe in Tenochtitlan, working in one of the government buildings near the Templo Mayor. Your job is to record tribute payments in a codex, a folded bark paper book covered in colorful pictographic writing. Every day, you document what arrives from across the empire: bundles of cotton cloth from the hot coastal regions, cacao beans from the south, jade from Guatemala, turquoise from the far north, jaguar skins from the jungle lowlands, and thousands of other goods. The tribute system was staggeringly complex and remarkably efficient. The Aztecs maintained detailed records of exactly what each conquered province owed, how often they had to pay, and in what quantities. These weren't arbitrary demands. The Aztecs carefully calculated what each region could actually produce. A mountain town wouldn't be asked to send tropical birds. A coastal city wouldn't be required to send mountain herbs. The codex, known as the Matricula de Tributos, which partially survived the Spanish conquest, gives us a window into this system. It records that one province sent 4,000 bundles of paper twice a year. Another sent 400 warriors' costumes, complete with shields. Yet another provided 2 bins of cacao beans, each bin containing 24,000 beans. The scale is breathtaking. Conservative estimates suggest that Tenochtitlan received tribute from roughly 370 different towns and cities across central Mexico. But goods weren't the only thing flowing into the capital. Information came too. The Pochteca, the long-distance merchants, were the arteries of this system. These weren't just traders. They were intelligence agents, diplomats, and explorers all rolled into one. The Pochteca formed their own hereditary class, separate from both nobles and commoners. They had their own god, Yakatecutli, the lord of the vanguard. They had their own courts and their own laws, and they operated with a remarkable degree of independence from the state. A Pochteca expedition could be gone for months or even years, traveling hundreds of miles into foreign territory. They carried goods from the highlands to trade in distant markets: obsidian blades, rabbit fur blankets, copper bells, and red cochineal dye. They returned with precious things that couldn't be found in central Mexico: jaguar pelts, brilliant quetzal feathers, amber, jade, and, of course, cacao. But while they traded, they also watched. They noted which cities seemed prosperous, which rulers appeared weak, which regions were in conflict. When they returned to Tenochtitlan, they reported to the Tlatoani, the emperor. Their intelligence often determined which cities would be targeted for conquest next. Sometimes, the Pochteca were used more directly. The Aztecs would send merchants into a city with expensive goods, then accuse that city of murdering the merchants or stealing their wares. This manufactured outrage became the pretext for war and conquest. It was cynical, calculated, and remarkably effective. The Pochteca themselves occupied a strange position in Aztec society. They were wealthy, sometimes fabulously so, but they had to be careful about displaying that wealth. Aztec society had strict sumptuary laws dictating who could wear what, who could live in stone houses, who could eat certain foods. The Pochteca, despite their riches, were technically commoners. If they flaunted their wealth too openly, they could face punishment or resentment from the nobility. So they developed a strange double life. In public, they dressed modestly. At home, they lived in luxury. They hosted elaborate private feasts for each other, where they could finally show off their imported finery, but these feasts were carefully hidden from public view. Now, let's talk about the Flower Wars again, because there's more to this story. The Xochiayotl, or Flower Wars, have been misunderstood for centuries. Spanish chroniclers, and many historians after them, presented these as purely ritualistic battles, fought solely to capture prisoners for sacrifice. But if you look more carefully at the evidence, a more complex picture emerges. Yes, capturing prisoners was important. In Aztec cosmology, the sun required nourishment in the form of human blood to continue its journey across the sky. Captured warriors were the most prestigious sacrificial victims, but the Flower Wars served several other crucial functions. First, they were training grounds. In times of peace, how do you keep a warrior class sharp? The Aztecs solved this by maintaining permanent ritualized conflicts with certain rivals. Young warriors earned their rank not through heredity but through capturing enemies in battle. The Flower Wars provided a relatively controlled environment for this. Second, they were displays of power. When the Aztecs invited their allies to watch a flower war, they were demonstrating their military might. It was political theatre with real bloodshed. Third, and most interestingly, they were economic. Some scholars now believe the Flower Wars were actually a form of aggressive negotiation. By maintaining constant pressure on states like Tlaxcala without fully conquering them, the Aztecs created a permanent threat that encouraged other cities to submit peacefully and pay tribute rather than face invasion. The empire, in other words, was a complex machine with many moving parts: the tribute system that funneled wealth to the center, the Pochteca network that provided intelligence and trade, the military apparatus that enforced compliance, and the ritualized warfare that kept everyone sharp and afraid. It was not a simple story of savage conquerors. It was a sophisticated political and economic system that, for nearly a century, dominated one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. And at the center of this vast machine sat the Tlatoani, the emperor, in his palace in Tenochtitlan. He was served by hundreds of nobles, advised by councils, protected by elite warriors. He lived in a world of unimaginable luxury. He ate from gold plates. He slept on cotton sheets. He bathed multiple times a day in private baths. He had access to a private zoo and botanical gardens that contained specimens from every corner of the empire. But he was also a prisoner of ritual and obligation. Every decision, every action, was hemmed in by tradition, by religious duty, by the expectations of the nobility and the priesthood. He was the most powerful man in Mesoamerica and, in many ways, the least free. This was the system that ruled central Mexico in the early 1500s. It was powerful, wealthy, and confident. It was also brittle. The subject peoples resented their overlords. The Flower War enemies like Tlaxcala burned with hatred. The system depended on continued success, continued expansion, continued tribute flowing into the capital. And in 1519, when strange bearded men arrived from the Eastern Sea, the entire machine would begin to tear itself apart. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the fall, we need to understand what was being destroyed. We need to talk about Aztec science, engineering, and medicine. Because this wasn't just a military empire. It was a civilization of remarkable intellectual achievement. Chapter 4. Science of the Sun. Here's something they definitely didn't teach you in school. The Aztecs were better astronomers than most Europeans of the same era. The Aztec calendar system, often reduced to a tourist curiosity or a prop in doomsday conspiracy theories, was actually a sophisticated tool for tracking time, seasons, and celestial events. The Aztecs didn't just have one calendar. They had two, running simultaneously and interlocking in complex ways. The first was the Xiuhpohualli, the solar calendar, which consisted of 365 days divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days at the end. This calendar tracked the agricultural year and was used for scheduling festivals and ceremonies. The second was the Tonalpohualli, the sacred calendar, which ran for 260 days in cycles of 13 numbers combined with 20-day signs. This calendar was used for divination, for naming children, and for determining lucky and unlucky days for various activities. These two calendars meshed together like gears, and it took exactly 52 years for the same combination of day signs to repeat. This 52-year cycle, called a Xiuhmolpilli, or calendar round, was enormously important in Aztec life. At the end of each cycle, there was a great ceremony called the New Fire Ceremony, where all fires in the empire were extinguished and then relit from a single sacred fire. It was a moment of cosmic renewal and intense anxiety, because the Aztecs believed the world might not survive to see another cycle. But here's what's remarkable. This calendar system was accurate. The Aztec solar year calculation was 365.24, 2 days long. The actual solar year is 365.242, 2 days long. That's an error of less than 1/10,000th of a day per year. The Julian calendar, used in Europe at the same time, was significantly less accurate, which is why it eventually had to be replaced by the Gregorian calendar. How did they achieve this accuracy? Through centuries of patient observation. Aztec priests studied the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars from the tops of their pyramids. They knew the cycles of Venus. They could predict eclipses. They understood that certain celestial events correlated with agricultural cycles, with the rainy season, with the appearance and migration of animals. This wasn't mysticism. This was empirical science conducted over generations. Now let's talk about Chinampas again, because calling them floating gardens really undersells what an extraordinary innovation they were. A Chinampa was built by driving stakes into the lake bed to create a rectangular enclosure, then filling it with layers of lake mud, aquatic vegetation, and decaying plant matter. Willow trees were planted at the corners and edges. Their roots grew down and anchored the entire structure, while their leaves provided shade and their branches could be cut for building materials. The result was a raised agricultural plot surrounded on all sides by water. And here's the genius part. The water acted as a natural irrigation system. The farmers didn't need to carry water to their crops. The crops' roots could reach down into the water below. At the same time, the canals between the Chinampas served as transportation routes. You could paddle your canoe right up to your field to harvest your crops. This system was so efficient that Chinampas could produce up to 7 harvests per year of certain crops. A single hectare of Chinampa could feed a family of 15 to 20 people. Modern agricultural studies have shown that Chinampas, when properly maintained, can produce more food per acre than contemporary mechanized agriculture, and they do so sustainably, without depleting the soil, because the farmers constantly replenished it with nutrient-rich lake muck. At its height, Tenochtitlan and the surrounding lake had roughly 30,000 acres of chinampas, feeding a population of several 100,000 people. It was a closed-loop ecological system. Human waste was used as fertilizer. Lake plants were used to build and maintain the chinampas. The canals were stocked with fish and amphibians for protein, and birds were attracted to the area, providing both eggs and meat. The Spanish, when they conquered Mexico, destroyed this system. They drained the lakes, turning the Valley of Mexico into the dust bowl it largely remains today. It was an ecological catastrophe from which the region has never recovered. Modern Mexico City, built on the dry lake bed, sinks a little bit every year because the ground beneath it is compacting. But the Aztecs didn't just feed themselves ingeniously, they also healed themselves with remarkable sophistication. Aztec medicine was based on a combination of empirical observation and spiritual belief, which honestly describes most medical systems throughout history, including European medicine of the same period. The Aztecs had a pharmacopoeia of more than 3,000 medicinal plants. They understood which herbs brought down fever, which stopped bleeding, which eased pain, which fought infection. The Spanish physician Francisco Hernandez spent years in Mexico after the conquest cataloging these plants, and his work reveals the extraordinary depth of Aztec botanical knowledge. They used willow bark, which contains the compound that would later be synthesized as aspirin to reduce pain and inflammation. They used the passion flower as a sedative. They used the sap of the maguey plant as an antibiotic on wounds. These weren't just folk remedies. Modern pharmacology has validated the effectiveness of many of these treatments. Aztec physicians, called Tizitl, performed successful surgeries. They set broken bones using splints. They stitched wounds with human hair. And, most remarkably, they performed trepanation, which is drilling holes into the skull to relieve pressure on the brain. Skulls have been found with clear evidence of successful trepanation, meaning the patient survived, the bone healed, and the person lived for years afterward. This is brain surgery, performed with obsidian tools, with no anesthesia beyond herbal preparations, and with success rates that were honestly comparable to similar procedures in Europe. They also practiced dentistry. Evidence suggests they treated cavities and abscesses, and even performed some dental restoration using materials like jade and gold. And here's something that should humble us. Aztec society had universal education. Every child, male or female, rich or poor, attended school. There were two types of schools. The Telpoch or House of Youth, educated commoners in basic skills, warfare, and citizenship. The Karmakak educated the children of nobles and trained them to become priests, scribes, military leaders, and administrators. This meant that Aztec society had near universal literacy in their pictographic writing system. Europe, in the 1500s, by contrast, had literacy rates that rarely climbed above 20% and far lower for women. The picture that emerges is not of a primitive society, but of a scientifically curious, intellectually sophisticated, and highly educated civilization. They were empirical observers of the natural world. They turned challenging environments into sustainable food systems. They developed effective medical practices. They were, in short, not so different from us. Which brings us to the part of the story everyone knows, the part that's been used for 500 years to justify their destruction: human sacrifice. It's time we talked about it honestly. Chapter 5. The Truth About Sacrifice. Let's not dance around this. The Aztecs practiced human sacrifice, and they did so on a scale that was shocking even by the standards of their time and place. This is the part of the story that everyone knows, the part that's been used for 5 centuries to paint the Aztecs as bloodthirsty savages who deserved conquest, conversion, and cultural annihilation. It's the image that dominates every movie, every textbook mention, every casual reference to Aztec civilization. So let's talk about it. Honestly, without minimizing it, but also without letting it be the only thing we see. First, the facts. Yes, the Aztecs performed human sacrifice as a regular part of their religious practice. Victims, usually but not always war captives, were led to the top of a pyramid. There, priests would stretch them over a stone, cut open their chest with an obsidian blade, and remove their still-beating heart as an offering to the gods. The body would then be rolled down the pyramid steps. This happened. It happened regularly. And it happened at the Templo Mayor in the center of Tenochtitlan, where everyone could see it. The scale is harder to determine. The Spanish chroniclers, particularly the Conquistadors and the priests who came after them, recorded absolutely staggering numbers. Some claimed that during the dedication of the expanded Templo Mayor in 1487, somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 people were sacrificed over 4 days. These numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, probably wildly so. Modern archaeologists and anthropologists have examined the evidence carefully, the physical evidence, the bones, the tool marks, the capacity of the spaces involved, and they've concluded that while sacrifice happened regularly, the Spanish accounts inflated the numbers by a factor of 10 or more, sometimes 20. Why would they exaggerate? Because they needed to. The Spanish conquest of Mexico was legally and morally justified, in the eyes of Europe, by the argument that they were saving the native people from Satangent worship and human sacrifice. The worse the Aztecs looked, the more righteous the conquest appeared. Every Spanish chronicle had a vested interest in making the Aztecs seem as monstrous as possible. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means we need to be careful about our sources. But here's the more important question. Why did they do it? To understand Aztec sacrifice, you have to understand Aztec cosmology, their understanding of how the universe worked. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was theology. The Aztecs believed that the world had been created and destroyed 4 times before. Each time, the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the sun, the earth, and humanity. Each time, the world had ended in catastrophe. The current world, the 5th sun, was also doomed to eventual destruction, but its end could be delayed. How? By repaying the debt humanity owed to the gods. The gods had spilled their blood to create the world. Humanity had to spill blood to keep the world going. Specifically, the sun god Huitzilopochtli needed nourishment to continue his daily battle against the forces of darkness. Every night, the sun died. Every morning, it had to be reborn. This rebirth required sacrifice. Without it, the sun would fail to rise, the world would be plunged into eternal darkness, and everything would end. This wasn't metaphor to them. This was cosmological physics. Sacrifice was how the universe worked. Now, before we judge this too harshly, let's talk about Europe. In 1519, the same year Cortés was watching sacrifices in Tenochtitlan, what was happening in Europe? The Spanish Inquisition was operating at full power. People accused of heresy were tortured, often for weeks, with devices designed to inflict maximum pain. If they confessed, they were strangled before being burned at the stake as an act of mercy. If they didn't confess, they were burned alive. Their families were forced to watch. The Church taught that this was necessary to save souls and purify Christendom. In England, just a few years later, Henry VIII would execute somewhere between 57,000 and 72,000 people during his reign, many by the spectacularly brutal method of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This meant being hanged until nearly dead, cut down, having your intestines removed while you were still alive, then being beheaded and cut into quarters. These executions were public events. People brought their children to watch. In France and Germany, thousands of women, mostly elderly or socially marginal, were being burned alive as witches. Their trials were travesties. Their executions were communal events, attended by entire towns. Across Europe, public executions were not just common but popular entertainment. Breaking on the wheel, where the condemned person's limbs were methodically shattered with an iron bar, and then they were left to die over the course of days, was considered a normal punishment for serious crimes. I'm not saying this to excuse Aztec sacrifice. I'm saying this to provide context. The Aztecs killed people for religious reasons. Europeans killed people for religious reasons, for political reasons, for social control, and often just to demonstrate power. Both societies used ritualized violence as a tool. The difference is that Europeans recorded their own violence as justice, civilization, and holy duty. while recording Aztec violence as savage barbarism. But there's another crucial difference that's often overlooked. Aztec sacrifice, brutal as it was, conferred honor. Warriors fought to capture enemies, specifically because a warrior who was sacrificed was believed to achieve the highest possible afterlife, joining the sun god in his daily journey across the sky. To die on the sacrificial stone was, in Aztec belief, glorious. In European executions, by contrast, the goal was humiliation, degradation, the complete destruction of the person's dignity before their death. The cruelty was the point. I'm not asking you to think Aztec sacrifice was good or acceptable. I'm asking you to recognize that every society in the 1600s practiced violence in the name of higher powers. The Aztecs were not uniquely monstrous. They were people of their time, operating within their own cosmological framework. And here's what's been lost in 5 centuries of focus on sacrifice. It was one aspect of a complex religious and cultural system. To reduce the Aztecs to human sacrifice is like reducing Christianity to the Inquisition or the Crusades. It happened. It was significant, but it wasn't the whole story. The Aztecs also believed in poetry as a form of prayer. They held that the highest purpose of life was to create beauty and truth, expressed in the Nahuatl phrase, in Exochitl, in Cucatl, flower, and song. They debated philosophy and the nature of existence. They questioned whether their gods were real or metaphors. They had a rich tradition of religious doubt and inquiry. One Aztec poet-philosopher, whose name has come down to us as Nezahualcoyotl, wrote, "Is it true that one lives on earth? Not forever on earth, only a little while here. Though it be jade, it breaks. Though it be gold, it is crushed. Though it be quetzal feather, it is torn apart. Not forever on earth, only a little while here." This is not the voice of a mindless savage. This is sophisticated philosophical poetry about the transience of life and the inevitability of death. The Aztecs contained multitudes. They were capable of great beauty and great cruelty, just like every other human society that has ever existed. But because of the sacrifices, because of the Spanish accounts written to justify conquest, because of 500 years of propaganda, we remember only the cruelty. It's time to remember the rest. Chapter 6. Beauty and the Sacred. The Aztecs believed that the highest form of human expression was not warfare, not even religion in the formal sense, but something they called in Exochitl, in Cuicatl, flower and song, poetry and art. This might surprise you, given everything you've heard about them. But in Aztec philosophy, the greatest thing a person could do with their life was to create beauty that would outlast them. Warriors were honored, priests were respected, but poets, the ones who could capture truth in beautiful words, they were considered to touch the divine. The Aztec elite gathered regularly for poetry contests and philosophical debates. These weren't casual affairs. They were formal events where the best minds of the empire would come together to discuss the nature of reality, the existence of an afterlife, the meaning of human existence. One of the most remarkable aspects of Aztec thought was their deep uncertainty about religious truth. Unlike the absolute certainty you find in many religious traditions, Aztec philosophers openly questioned whether the gods were real or simply useful metaphors. They debated whether anything in life was truly permanent or if everything was illusion. The poet king Nezahualcoyotl, who ruled the city of Texcoco in the mid-1400s, wrote extensively about the transient nature of life and the impossibility of certainty. His poems, some of which survived the conquest, read like existential philosophy. He questioned everything, including the very gods his priests sacrificed to. This intellectual culture produced not just philosophy but extraordinary art. Take featherwork, for example. To the Aztecs, a skilled feather artist was worth more than a goldsmith. The most precious thing you could own wasn't a gold ornament. It was a piece made from the iridescent green tail feathers of the quetzal bird. Featherworkers, called amantica, formed their own specialized guild. They created elaborate headdresses, shields, and cloaks by carefully tying thousands of individual feathers to a backing of cotton or paper. The results were spectacular, shimmering works of art that changed color as you moved around them. The famous headdress of Moctezuma, which sits today in a museum in Vienna, is made from more than 200 quetzal tail feathers, along with blue cotinga feathers and feathers from other tropical birds. Each feather was more valuable than gold because these birds couldn't be raised in captivity. The feathers had to be collected in distant jungles, transported hundreds of miles, and then assembled by artists who had trained for decades to master their craft. Only a handful of these featherworks survived the conquest. The Spanish, who valued gold and silver, often burned or discarded the featherwork, not understanding that they were destroying objects the Aztecs considered far more precious than any metal. Music and dance were equally important. Every religious ceremony, every important state occasion involved elaborate performances. Aztec drums, the teponaztli and the huehuetl, created complex rhythms. Shell horns and flutes provided melody, and hundreds of dancers, trained from childhood, performed intricate, choreographed movements that could last for hours. The Spanish, watching these performances, were genuinely impressed by the skill and coordination involved, even as they condemned the religious content. Now, here's something that will surprise you. The Aztecs had botanical gardens and zoos before most European cities. Moctezuma II maintained enormous gardens at several royal estates. These weren't just decorative, they were scientific institutions. Plants were collected from every corner of the empire and beyond. Each plant was labeled with information about where it came from and what it could be used for. Gardeners cultivated medicinal herbs, food plants, and purely ornamental species. The Spanish chronicler, Bernal Diaz, described walking through these gardens and being overwhelmed by the variety and beauty of the plants, many of which he had never seen before. The royal zoo was even more impressive. It housed jaguars, pumas, wolves, eagles, and dozens of other species. There was a separate building for reptiles, including several large snake species. There was an aquarium section with both saltwater and freshwater fish. And there was an aviary that Spanish accounts describe as spectacular, filled with birds in every color imaginable. The zoo required a permanent staff of hundreds. There were keepers who fed and cared for the animals. There were veterinarians who treated sick creatures. And there were hunters who went out daily to catch the massive amounts of game needed to feed the carnivores. When Cortez's men first saw this zoo, they couldn't believe it. Nothing like it existed in Europe. The closest equivalent was the menagerie at the Tower of London, which was a tiny collection by comparison. All of this, the zoo, the gardens, the art, the poetry, was destroyed. The Spanish conquistadors killed the animals for sport or out of fear. They burned the gardens. They melted down the gold artwork and shipped it to Spain, where most of it was melted down again to make coins. But perhaps nothing was more tragic than the destruction of the books. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican peoples created books called codices, made from bark paper or deerskin, folded like accordions. These codices contained everything: historical records, astronomical observations, tribute lists, religious ceremonies, calendars, and medicinal knowledge. The Spanish priests, convinced these were the devil's work, burned them. By the thousands, a Spanish friar named Diego de Landa, working in the Yucatan among the Maya, wrote, "We found a large number of books in these characters, and, as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen, superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all. Only a handful of pre-conquest codices survived. 4 Aztec codices, 3 or 4 Maya codices. That's all that remains of countless thousands. Imagine if someone had burned every book in Renaissance Europe except for 7. That's what happened here. The loss is incalculable. We'll never know how much knowledge, how much poetry, how much history was destroyed in those fires. But we know enough to understand this. The Aztecs were not savages waiting for European civilization. They were artists, philosophers, scientists, and engineers who had built a sophisticated culture that valued beauty, learning, and intellectual inquiry. They drank exocolatl, a bitter chocolate drink mixed with chili peppers, which was considered so precious that only nobles could consume it regularly. They played a ball game called Ullamalistli in massive stone courts, a game that was part sport, part religious ritual, and entirely unique to Mesoamerica. They bred hairless dogs called Exoloitzcuintli, which served as both companions and occasionally food at important feasts. They were fully, completely human, with all the complexity that implies, and in 1519, everything they had built was about to come crashing down, not because they were weak, not because their culture was inferior, but because of a combination of disease, political miscalculation, and the arrival of men from across the ocean who carried weapons and germs against which the Aztecs had no defense. Chapter 7. The World Turned Upside Down. In the year 13 Reed, by the Aztec calendar, which we call 1519, something impossible happened. Mountains appeared on the eastern sea, mountains that moved, mountains with wings like great birds. This is how the Aztec accounts describe the first sighting of Spanish ships off the coast of Mexico. The reports were rushed to Tenochtitlan, to the palace of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, known to us as Moctezuma II. He was 40 years old, had been emperor for 17 years, and was considered one of the most powerful men in the world. He received this news with what the accounts describe as great anxiety. Why? Because it seemed to confirm his worst fears. Moctezuma was deeply religious, even by Aztec standards. He had trained as a priest before becoming emperor. He paid careful attention to omens, to prophecies, to anything that might reveal the will of the gods. And for several years, there had been disturbing signs. 8 years earlier, the temple of Huitzilopochtli had spontaneously caught fire and burned despite all efforts to extinguish it. A comet had appeared in the daytime sky. Lightning had struck another temple on a clear day. A mysterious woman's voice had been heard at night, weeping and crying out, "My children, we are lost." Fishermen had caught a strange bird with a mirror in its head, and when Moctezuma looked into the mirror, he saw armed men riding on the backs of deer. All of these events were recorded and interpreted as omens of disaster. And there was a prophecy, a very specific prophecy. The god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a deity associated with wisdom, wind, and the morning star, had once been a king, according to Aztec mythology. He had ruled during a golden age, but had been tricked and driven out by rivals. When he left, sailing away on a raft of serpents toward the east, he had promised to return in the year 1 Reed to reclaim his kingdom. 1519 was the year 1 Reed. Now, here's where we need to be very careful. The idea that Moctezuma believed Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl has been repeated so many times it's become historical fact, but the actual evidence is murky. Most of what we know comes from Spanish sources written years after the conquest, and they had every reason to portray Moctezuma as paralyzed by superstition. What we can say is this: Moctezuma was cautious, he was uncertain, and he made a series of decisions that, in hindsight, were catastrophic. When news arrived that the strange men from the sea had landed and were marching inland, Moctezuma sent gifts: gold, fine cloth, and turquoise. This was standard diplomatic protocol. You honored powerful strangers. You established communication. You tried to understand their intentions. The gifts had the opposite effect. When Cortés and his men saw the gold, they became obsessed. Cortés famously said, "We Spanish suffer from a disease of the heart that can only be cured by gold." The small Spanish expedition, about 500 men, began marching toward Tenochtitlan. They were led by Hernán Cortés, a minor Spanish nobleman from Extremadura, who had come to the Caribbean years earlier seeking his fortune and had so far found very little. Cortés was brave, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. He was also brilliant at reading political situations and exploiting them. As he marched inland, he made a crucial alliance. The city-state of Tlaxcala, which had fought the Aztecs for generations through the Flower Wars and had never been conquered, saw the Spanish as potential allies. After a brief conflict, the Tlaxcalans joined forces with Cortés. This was the beginning of the end. Cortés didn't conquer the Aztec Empire. He couldn't have. His few hundred men could never have defeated an empire of millions. But with the Tlaxcalans providing thousands of warriors, with other subject peoples joining the rebellion against Aztec rule, Cortés became the leader of an indigenous civil war. Still, Moctezuma didn't attack. He continued trying to negotiate, to offer gifts, to find a peaceful solution. Some have interpreted this as weakness or superstitious paralysis. But there's another explanation. Moctezuma was trying to avoid a war he wasn't sure he could win cleanly. The Spanish had horses, which no one in Mesoamerica had ever seen. They looked like monstrous combinations of man and deer. The Spanish had steel swords and armor. They had crossbows. And most terrifyingly, they had guns and cannons, weapons that made sounds like thunder and could kill from distances that seemed impossible. Moctezuma may have calculated that allowing them to enter the city peacefully and then surrounding them would be safer than trying to fight them in open country where their strange advantages would be most useful. In November of 1519, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies entered Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma himself came out to greet them, carried on a litter, dressed in his finest regalia. It was a formal, careful meeting between two leaders trying to assess each other. Cortés was housed in a palace in the center of the city. He and his men were treated as honored guests. Feasts were prepared. Entertainment was provided. Moctezuma visited regularly, engaging in long conversations through interpreters, particularly a woman known to history as La Malinche or Doña Marina. La Malinche is one of the most controversial figures in Mexican history. She was a Nahua woman who had been sold into slavery, passed between different groups, and eventually given to Cortés. She spoke both Nahuatl and Mayan, and she quickly learned Spanish. She became Cortés's translator, advisor, and eventually his mistress. Without her, Cortés would have been unable to navigate the complex political landscape of Mexico. To some, she's a traitor who helped destroy her own people. To others, she's a survivor who made the best of an impossible situation. The truth is probably that she was a highly intelligent woman, with no particular loyalty to the Aztecs, who had enslaved her, and she chose to align herself with what seemed like the winning side. For several weeks, there was an uneasy peace. The Spanish were essentially prisoners in their palace, surrounded by a city of hundreds of thousands. But Moctezuma was also, in a strange way, a prisoner, unable to simply kill his guests without triggering a diplomatic catastrophe. Then Cortés made a shocking move. He took Moctezuma hostage, claiming it was for the emperor's own protection. Moctezuma, rather than resisting, agreed. He moved into the Spanish quarters and continued to rule, but now under Spanish guard. Why would he do this? The sources don't agree. Some say he was coerced. Some say he believed it was temporary. Some say he was genuinely uncertain about what to do and buying time. For months, this bizarre situation continued. Moctezuma, the most powerful man in Mesoamerica, lived as a hostage but still gave orders that were obeyed. Cortés controlled Moctezuma, but was surrounded by a hostile city. It was a stalemate built on confusion and mutual incomprehension. Then everything fell apart. Cortés had to leave the city to deal with a rival Spanish force that had been sent to arrest him for exceeding his authority. He left behind a subordinate, named Pedro de Alvarado. And Alvarado, during a religious festival, made a decision that ignited the powder keg. During a ceremony in the temple complex, while Aztec nobles were engaged in ritual dances, unarmed and dressed in their finest ceremonial clothing, Alvarado ordered his men to attack. They sealed the exits and began a massacre. Thousands were killed. Why did he do it? Spanish accounts claim he heard rumors of a planned uprising. Aztec accounts say there was no such plan. Modern historians suspect Alvarado panicked, or perhaps saw an opportunity to seize the gold jewelry the dancers were wearing. Whatever the reason, the result was catastrophic. The city erupted in rage. The Aztecs attacked the Spanish compound. Cortés, racing back to the city, barely made it inside before the siege began. The Spanish were trapped. Thousands of Aztec warriors surrounded them. Supplies were cut off. Attempts to break out were repelled with heavy losses. In desperation, the Spanish brought Moctezuma to the roof of the palace to address his people, to call for peace. But Moctezuma's authority was broken. The Aztecs shouted him down. Stones and arrows were thrown. Moctezuma was struck in the head. He died 3 days later, whether from his wounds or, as some sources suggest, killed by the Spanish who no longer needed him, we'll never know for certain. The Aztecs had chosen a new emperor, Moctezuma's brother Cuitlahua, and his first command was clear: drive out the invaders or kill them all. Chapter 8. The Fall of Tenochtitlan. The night of June 30th, 1520, is known to history as La Noche Triste, the sad night. The Spanish were trapped in their palace compound, surrounded, running out of food and water. Every attempt to break out had been repelled with heavy casualties. Men were dying not just from Aztec weapons but from hunger and thirst. Cortés made the decision. They would attempt a mass breakout under cover of darkness. It was raining, a heavy summer rain, and the Spanish hoped it would mask their movements. They built a portable bridge to span the gaps in the causeways because the Aztecs had torn up sections to prevent their escape. They loaded themselves down with as much gold as they could carry, melting down Aztec treasures and dividing the gold bars among the men. Then, at midnight, they began their escape. They made it perhaps halfway across the Tlacopan causeway before they were discovered. Drums sounded, conch horns blared, and suddenly the lake around them filled with thousands of war canoes. The Aztecs attacked from all sides. Warriors swarmed the causeway. Atlatl darts and arrows filled the air. The Spanish fought desperately, trying to push forward, but the causeway was narrow, and they were weighed down with gold. The portable bridge broke. Men fell into the water and drowned, dragged down by the weight of the gold they refused to abandon. Others were captured and dragged away. The escape became a rout, then a slaughter. Cortés lost more than half his men that night. Almost all the Tlaxcalan allies who had accompanied them died. All the cannons and guns were lost in the lake. Most of the horses were killed. The survivors, bloodied and traumatized, staggered into Tlaxcalan territory. Cortés supposedly sat beneath a tree and wept. The Aztecs had won, but they didn't follow up their victory. Why not? Because something far more deadly than Spanish swords had entered the city. Smallpox. One of the Spaniards who died during the fighting had been infected. The disease, to which Europeans had developed partial immunity over centuries, was completely unknown in the Americas. The indigenous people had no resistance to it whatsoever. Smallpox spread through Tenochtitlan like wildfire. It killed indiscriminately, young and old, warriors and children. The new emperor Cuitlahua died of it within weeks. A third of the city's population, perhaps more, died in the first epidemic. Bodies piled up faster than they could be disposed of. And it wasn't just smallpox. Measles, typhus, and other diseases followed. The biological catastrophe that the Spanish invasion unleashed would ultimately kill an estimated 90% of the indigenous population of Mexico over the following century. It was the greatest demographic collapse in human history. While the Aztecs were dying by the thousands, Cortés was rebuilding his forces. More Spanish adventurers arrived from Cuba, lured by tales of gold. The Tlaxcalans remained committed allies, and other subject peoples of the Aztec Empire, seeing weakness, began to rebel. Cortés made a brilliant strategic decision. He had his men build 13 brigantines, small sailing ships, and carried them in pieces over the mountains to Lake Texcoco, where they were assembled. This gave the Spanish control of the lake, something they'd lacked during their first invasion. In May of 1521, Cortés began the siege of Tenochtitlan. It would last 75 days and remain one of the most brutal sieges in history. The Aztecs were led by a new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, whose name means descending eagle. He was young, about 25 years old, a nephew of Moctezuma. He was also brave, capable, and absolutely determined to resist. The Spanish and their indigenous allies, who now numbered in the tens of thousands, attacked from all directions. They advanced slowly, fighting for every street, every canal, every building. The Aztecs fought desperately, turning their city into a fortress, using every building, every rooftop, as a defensive position. The Spanish employed a brutal tactic. Every building they captured, they demolished. They filled in the canals with rubble. Slowly, methodically, they destroyed the city to conquer it. Fresh water was cut off. Food supplies dwindled. Disease continued to rage. But the Aztecs didn't surrender. They couldn't. To surrender meant death or enslavement. So they fought on, even as they starved, even as they died. Cuauhtémoc attempted several times to break the siege. Aztec warriors launched night raids, trying to capture Spanish brigantines or break through the siege lines. They had some successes. They captured several Spaniards alive and sacrificed them in view of their companions, partly for religious reasons, partly to terrify the enemy. But the situation was hopeless. The city was being ground to dust. The population was dying, and no help was coming. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to flee the city by canoe with his family and closest advisors. He was captured by a Spanish brigantine. The siege was over. Tenochtitlan had fallen. What followed was a nightmare. The Spanish and their allies poured into the city. They looted everything of value. They enslaved the survivors. They tore apart buildings looking for hidden gold. The survivors, starving and sick, tried to flee or hide. The Spanish accounts describe the streets choked with bodies, the canals filled with the dead, the smell of death overwhelming everything. Bernal Diaz wrote, "I swear that all the houses and stockades in the lake were full of heads and corpses. I do not know how to describe it, but it was the same in the streets and courts. We could not walk without treading on the bodies and heads of dead Indians. When the Spanish finally tallied the cost, they estimated that 240,000 Aztecs had died during the siege, from fighting, starvation, or disease. The number might be exaggerated, but even if it's half that, it represents one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of warfare." Cuauhtémoc was brought before Cortés. According to the accounts, he said, "I have done everything in my power to defend my kingdom and my people. Since fortune has not favored me, take my life." Cortés didn't kill him immediately. Instead, he had Cuauhtémoc tortured, burning his feet to try to force him to reveal where more treasure was hidden. Cuauhtémoc endured this with stoic courage, supposedly mocking a companion who cried out in pain by asking, "Am I lying on a bed of roses?" Years later, on a march to Honduras, Cortés would have Cuauhtémoc hanged, claiming he was plotting rebellion. He was the last Aztec emperor, and he died with dignity. Tenochtitlan was gone. Not just defeated, but physically destroyed. The Spanish tore down every temple, every palace. They filled in the canals. They built Mexico City directly on top of the ruins, using the stones of Aztec buildings to construct Spanish churches. An entire world had ended. Chapter 9. What We Lost. The destruction of Tenochtitlan was not the end of the story. What followed was a systematic campaign to erase Aztec civilization from existence. The Spanish didn't just conquer, they erased. Within years of the conquest, Spanish authorities ordered the destruction of every temple, every sacred image, every religious structure. The great Templo Mayor, the spiritual heart of the empire, was torn down stone by stone. The stones were used to build the Mexico City Metropolitan Cathedral, which still stands today, literally built on top of the ruins of the Aztec sacred precinct. But the physical destruction was only part of it. The real catastrophe was cultural and intellectual. The Spanish priests, particularly the Franciscans who arrived in the 1520s, believed they were engaged in a holy war against Satan himself. Every Aztec book, every codex, every painted manuscript was seen as a tool of the devil. They had to be destroyed. The scale of this destruction is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine the Library of Alexandria, but instead of one fire, imagine dozens of fires in cities and towns across Mexico, each burning hundreds or thousands of books. That's what happened. We know from Spanish sources that there were vast libraries in Tenochtitlan, in Texcoco, in Tlaxcala, in dozens of other cities. One Spanish friar described a library in Texcoco that filled multiple rooms from floor to ceiling with codices. All of it was burned. A few Spanish priests, to their credit, recognized what was being lost. A Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades after the conquest, interviewing elderly Aztecs who remembered the pre-conquest world. He compiled this knowledge into an enormous work called the Florentine Codex, 12 volumes containing Aztec history, culture, natural history, and ethnography, all written in both Nahuatl and Spanish. Sahagún's work was suppressed by Spanish authorities. They thought it preserved too much indigenous knowledge, that it might encourage backsliding into paganism. The manuscript was hidden away in a library in Florence, hence the name, and wasn't widely known until the 19th century. By then, almost everything else was gone. Of the thousands upon thousands of Aztec codices, only about a dozen survive, and most of those are not from the Aztec heartland, but from surrounding regions. We have exactly 4 pre-conquest or early post-conquest codices that clearly show Aztec culture: the Codex Borbonicus, the Codex Mendoza, the Codex Magliabechiano, and a few fragments of others. That's it. That's all that remains of the written record of one of the largest empires in the world. The people themselves didn't disappear, but they were forcibly transformed. The Spanish colonial system, the encomienda, essentially enslaved the indigenous population. They were forced to work in mines, on plantations, building Spanish cities. They were required to convert to Catholicism or face punishment. Their children were taken and raised in Spanish missionary schools, where they were forbidden to speak Nahuatl or practice any traditional customs. The population collapse was staggering. The most conservative estimates suggest that the population of central Mexico before contact was around 10 million. By 1600, less than 80 years later, it had fallen to about 1 million. That's a 90% decline. Most died of disease, but many died from overwork, malnutrition, and the simple destruction of their social structures. The great city itself was literally erased. The Spanish drained the lakes that had surrounded Tenochtitlan. They wanted solid ground for their European-style city, and they were terrified of the flooding that had periodically threatened the Aztec capital. The chinampas, those incredible floating gardens, were destroyed or left to decay. The canals were filled in. The causeways became streets. The ecological transformation was as devastating as the cultural one. The Valley of Mexico had been a carefully managed wetland ecosystem. The Spanish turned it into a dust bowl. Mexico City, built on the drained lakebed, has been sinking ever since, sometimes as much as a foot per year in some areas, because the ground beneath it is compacting. For centuries, the ruins of the Aztec city lay buried beneath colonial Mexico City. People knew they were there, but they didn't care. Occasionally, workers digging foundations would find carved stones or gold objects. Usually, these were melted down or carted away. Then, in 1978, workers from Mexico City's electric company were digging near the Zocalo, the main square, when they hit something massive. It was a circular stone, more than 10 feet in diameter, carved with an intricate relief. It was the Coyolxauhqui stone, depicting the dismembered moon goddess. And it was part of the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, the absolute center of Aztec religious and political life. This discovery sparked an archaeological revolution. The Mexican government expropriated and demolished several city blocks of colonial buildings to excavate the site. What they found was extraordinary. The Templo Mayor had been built and rebuilt 7 times, each new pyramid constructed over the previous one, like layers of an onion. Spanish accounts had described it in detail, but actually excavating it revealed how accurate those descriptions were. They found caches of offerings, sacrificial knives, jade jewelry, carved shells, even the remains of sacrificial victims. They found evidence of the vast geographical reach of the Aztec Empire, seashells from both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, jade from Guatemala, turquoise from New Mexico. All of this had been brought as tribute or trade goods to the center of the Aztec world. The Templo Mayor Museum, which opened in 1987, now preserves and displays these findings. It's one of the most important archaeological sites in Mexico, and walking through it today gives you a glimpse of what was lost. But it's just a glimpse. 90% of Tenochtitlan remains buried beneath modern Mexico City. It can never be fully excavated because millions of people live on top of it. The modern city can't be destroyed to uncover the ancient one. Some things did survive, though, in unexpected ways. The Nahuatl language, though endangered, is still spoken by about 1.5 million people in Mexico today. It's one of the largest surviving indigenous language groups in the Americas. And DNA studies have shown that most Mexicans have significant indigenous ancestry, including Aztec. The people survived, even if their empire didn't. More subtly, Aztec culture survived in Mexican food. Chocolate, tomatoes, vanilla, chili peppers, avocados, squash, and dozens of other foods that are now eaten worldwide originated in Mesoamerica and were cultivated or domesticated by the Aztecs and their neighbors. Every time you eat salsa or guacamole, you're consuming foods that were developed over thousands of years by indigenous agriculturalists. The Aztecs also live on in place names. Mexico itself comes from Mexica. Scores of Mexican towns and cities have Nahuatl names: Oaxaca, Tlaxcala, Popocatépetl, Chapultepec. Even the word tomato comes from the Nahuatl tomatl. And in recent decades, there's been a conscious effort in Mexico to reclaim Aztec heritage. The image of the eagle and the serpent, from the founding myth of Tenochtitlan, appears on the Mexican flag. Aztec imagery appears in Mexican art, from the famous murals of Diego Rivera to modern street art. The name Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, is a popular name for boys in Mexico. There's a growing recognition that the Aztecs weren't primitive savages who were justly conquered. They were the ancestors of modern Mexicans, and their achievements deserve to be remembered and celebrated, not buried under centuries of propaganda. But the loss remains staggering. An entire civilization, as sophisticated as any in Europe or Asia, was destroyed in a matter of years. The knowledge accumulated over centuries was burned. The buildings were demolished. The people were enslaved or killed. We'll never fully know what was lost in that destruction, but we know enough to mourn it. Chapter 10. Legacy Beyond the Myth. For 500 years, the story of the Aztecs has been told by their conquerors. In that story, the Aztecs were bloodthirsty savages who practiced human sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. They were pagans who worshipped demons. They were primitive people who needed to be saved from themselves through conquest and conversion. The Spanish conquest was portrayed not as an invasion, but as a rescue mission, bringing civilization and Christianity to a dark and barbaric land. This narrative was convenient. It justified the conquest. It justified the enslavement of millions. It justified the theft of an entire continent's wealth, and it allowed Europeans to feel righteous about one of the greatest acts of cultural destruction in human history. But it was a lie, or at least a profound distortion. The real Aztecs, as we've seen, were something far more complex and far more interesting than the myth suggests. Yes, they practiced human sacrifice. We've acknowledged that honestly, but they were also sophisticated engineers who built a magnificent city in the middle of a lake using technologies that still impress modern architects and urban planners. They were agricultural innovators whose Chinampa farming system was more productive and more sustainable than most modern agriculture. They turned a swamp into a breadbasket that fed hundreds of thousands of people. They were astronomers who created calendars more accurate than those used in Europe at the same time. They were mathematicians who understood the concept of zero independently of the old world. They were physicians who performed successful surgeries with obsidian tools and maintained a pharmacopoeia of 3,000 medicinal plants. They were artists who created featherwork so exquisite that the Spanish valued it more highly than gold, at least until they melted the gold down. They were poets and philosophers who debated the nature of truth, beauty, and existence with a sophistication that would have impressed the ancient Greeks. They built a society where every child, regardless of gender or social class, received an education. This was something Europe wouldn't achieve for another 300 years. They created a tribute system that efficiently organized an empire of millions across a geographically diverse and challenging landscape. They built roads, maintained rest stations for travelers, and developed a messenger system that could deliver information from one end of the empire to the other faster than horseback riders could manage in Europe. They had zoos and botanical gardens for both scientific study and public enjoyment before most European cities had conceived of such things. And they did all of this without a single-wheeled vehicle, without beasts of burden, without iron tools, and without written alphabetic text. They invented solutions to problems that European technology wouldn't solve for centuries. The narrative that the Spanish brought civilization to Mexico is backward. Both societies were civilized. Both had remarkable achievements. Both were also capable of terrible cruelty. The difference is that European diseases and European technology in the form of steel, guns, and ships gave the Spanish a devastating advantage. And European greed for gold motivated them to use that advantage to destroy rather than to learn. Imagine, for a moment, an alternate history. Imagine if the Spanish had arrived not as conquerors, but as trading partners. Imagine if European diseases had spread more slowly, allowing indigenous populations time to develop immunity. Imagine if the knowledge in those thousands of codices had been preserved, translated, and shared with the world instead of being burned. We would live in a fundamentally different world. Medical knowledge from 3,000 Aztec medicinal plants might have advanced pharmacology by centuries. Agricultural techniques from Chinampa farming might have solved food security problems. Astronomical observations might have enhanced European science. Instead, all of that knowledge was deliberately destroyed because it came from people who were labeled as savages, as less than human, as devil worshippers. The greatest tragedy of the Spanish conquest isn't just the death toll, staggering as it was. It's the lost potential. It's the books we'll never read, the medicines we'll never discover, the art we'll never see, the ideas we'll never encounter. But here's what we can do. 500 years later, we can tell the truth. We can teach the real history of the Aztecs, not the propaganda version designed to justify genocide. We can acknowledge their achievements alongside their flaws. We can recognize them as fully human, which means recognizing them as capable of both great beauty and great cruelty, just like every other human society that has ever existed. We can stop reducing them to human sacrifice and start seeing them as the engineers, scientists, artists, and philosophers they actually were. And we can learn from their achievements. Modern researchers are studying Chinampa agriculture to develop sustainable farming techniques. Urban planners are looking at Tenochtitlan's layout to understand how to build cities in challenging environments. Medical researchers are investigating the plants Aztec physicians used, finding compounds that modern medicine has overlooked. The Aztecs are not just ancient history. Their legacy is alive in the DNA of millions of Mexicans, in the Nahuatl language still spoken today, in the foods eaten worldwide, in the place names across Mexico, and in the growing pride Mexicans feel in their indigenous heritage. For too long, the story of the Americas has been told as if history began in 1492 when Columbus arrived. But that's the story of European involvement in the Americas. The actual history goes back thousands of years before that. The Aztecs built their empire over about 90 years, from 1428 to 1521. In that brief time, they created something remarkable. They deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to European expansion, not as convenient villains in a tale of civilizational triumph, but as a sophisticated society that achieved extraordinary things. They deserve to be remembered for what they built, not just for what they destroyed. For their poetry, not just their sacrifices. For their gardens, not just their wars. For their schools, not just their temples of blood. The Aztec Empire fell 500 years ago. But the Aztec people, their descendants, their achievements, and their legacy remain. And that legacy is far richer, far more complex, and far more worthy of respect than the simple story of savages and sacrifice we've been told for centuries. It's time to remember the whole truth. It's time to remember the Aztec Empire beyond human sacrifice. And so we come to the end of our journey through the Aztec Empire. We've walked through the impossible city of Tenochtitlan, floated on canals between chinampas, heavy with crops, stood in the gardens where healers cultivated 3,000 medicinal plants. We've watched poets compete in verbal beauty, warriors train for battle, children attend schools that educated every member of society, regardless of birth. We've witnessed the arrival of the Spanish, the confusion and tragedy that followed, the desperate resistance, and the final, catastrophic fall. We've mourned the burning of the books, the destruction of the temples, the death of 90% of the population, and we've learned that history is never as simple as the stories we're told. The Aztecs were not monsters or saints. They were human beings, as complex and contradictory as we are today. They built something magnificent in less than a century. They deserve to be remembered for all of it, the beauty and the darkness, the achievement and the tragedy. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. I hope I've given you a new perspective on a civilization that's been misunderstood for far too long. If you enjoyed this exploration, please consider liking and subscribing. And I'd love to know, has this changed how you think about the Aztecs? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a peaceful night. Sleep well, and dream of feathered serpents and floating cities. Good night.